This is a question from John Smith, who says, why do you guys propose on your podcast that Starmer is currently lying, intending on being radical and inspiring once in office? Don't you think with a 30-point lead in the polls, he can afford to show his true colours now?
I suppose it is the overarching question of a lot of columns, YouTube videos and podcasts such as this. Who is Keir Starmer, really? And it's always really to really emphasise the mystique. There's two sort of schools of thought here. Some see him as a pragmatic operator, sort of keeping his cards close to his chest, doing what he needs to do to win, while others sort of see him as this quiet radical who, once he does get into number 10, will sort of have a bolder agenda. Freddie, where do you think the truth lies?
So this debate is essentially saying, and I often think it's Tories who say this, out of fear. So many of them look at Keir Starmer, they don't trust that he's not going to be as radical as he claims, in part because of Tony Blair. They remember Tony Blair and they remember that he committed to conservative tax plans, and then he came in and they saw that he ripped up the constitution, he introduced all these social reforms, and they didn't like that. So the fear is that in some ways, Keir Starmer is going to fundamentally change the social and constitutional framework of the UK. They'll look at things like the Brown Report, that devolution, the social environmental rights, the House of Lords, and they'll be concerned. And then on the left, I think you have this hope for some, and this the cynicism from others, that Keir Starmer will come in, having won the election and hopefully a big majority for him. Then he'll institute these big economic reforms because he'll have greater leeway. So this gets down to the fundamental point of whether politicians are really giving us the true answers as to what they're going to do in office now. So I think the reason why Labour might be more radical in office is that they have this thing called a doctor's mandate. They can come in and say, even though we didn't promise to do certain things during the campaign, we've come in, things are so bad now, we've looked at the finances, we're going to have to be more radical. So what are they going to do? Maybe they'll raise taxes based on that doctor's mandate, maybe they'll change their fiscal framework. So I think you'll see some change there. But fundamentally, I think we actually know what Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are going to do. I don't think there's a huge amount of ambiguity. If you read the briefing documents, of which there are many, and we must say of which the Tories just do not have. The Tories constantly charge Labour with having no plan. At least they have some framework around which they're going to work. So I think there's a lot of radicalism within those missions, as they're called. But let's see. It has to be within those two different ways. It has to be either Blairism through the constitutional and social reforms, or through this doctor's mandate. Things that are worse than we thought they were, therefore we're going to be more radical.
Rachel, how do you see it?
So what I think is really interesting about this question is don't you think with a 30-point lead, maybe 25 points, maybe 20 points, but a significant lead, that he can afford to show his true colours? And I completely understand that as a listener question. But if you speak to Labour MPs, anyone involved with the campaign at all, shadow ministers, they will all push back really hard on this idea that the election is already a given. And some of that is about managing expectations. Some of that is about the fact that Labour has historically been quite scarred by the polls looking more positive for them than they were on polling day. The fact that only 6 Labour leaders have ever won an election. The sense from Labour is that, the polls say one thing, but we've got all of this against us. We've got, sort of historic norms. The media is against us. It's really difficult to run a positive campaign, because an inspirational campaign, because there's sort of so little money. We have to just not make any mistakes. And so while it may look like, well, they're obviously going to win, so why can't they say all this radical stuff? They are playing an incredibly defensive game in that they don't want to give any kind of ammunition for the Conservatives to sort of seize on and say, look at how radical they are. Look, you should be afraid of them. Afraid of Labour. And I think one of the things that the Conservatives are really struggling with is that Keir Starmer isn't a really scary, threatening figure. You might think he's quite boring. You might think he's quite bland. Technocratic is a word that gets thrown around a lot. He's quite similar in demeanour to Rishi Sunak in a lot of ways. But they had great fun with Jeremy Corbyn kind of whipping up this sense of you cannot trust this man to be Prime Minister. You have to vote Conservative because look at what you will be risking if you don't. You can't really do that with Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
Keir Starmer is, I mean...
Yeah, the headlines are harder to write, I suppose, a bit.
Yeah, and so... that is a kind of selling point for Labour to just be as sort of defensive as possible. And they know that if anything comes across as a little bit radical, it's just going to be amplified by the Conservative messaging because that is all that they have. So I think that's why you're seeing this very kind of quiet campaign from Labour so far, although obviously that will heat up during the actual election campaign. It feels like we're in an election campaign. We're not in an election campaign.
Not yet.
When we get into it, I think it will get a little bit more lively, shall we say.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we should also note the fact that there is a difference of opinion within Labour. I've been speaking to a lot of cabinet ministers recently who are getting increasingly anxious and annoyed with some of the decision making in Lotto and also the lack of hope. And they don't see this as, well, we want to do things in office, so let's get a mandate now. They see it as important to winning the election. They're concerned that voters won't be engaged, they won't be enthused by the Labour's offering, and therefore they won't come out and vote for the party. So it's an electoral instrumental concern. So there is a split of opinion there. I think you're right, though, overall, that, Keir Starmer's office, the key strategists are much more concerned about going too far the other way. And they think, I think they're probably right, in part just because the Tories are failing to offer their own vision. So Labour can sort of sit still and watch the Tories cannibalise themselves, as they do so remarkably well every single day with such panache, that Labour can just sit there and voters will come to them as the default alternative.
But I suppose, like, as you sort of said, when you dig into it, there is a bold statement in the mission-driven government, but I suppose the issue for it, similar to Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges, is that it's harder for voters to actually recall what those are and let alone to, I suppose, buy into it when it's very hard to get that cut through to people. Yeah,
it is. I mean, in the question, we've got both the words radical and inspiring, which are probably different things. I mean, it's very hard to define what it means to be radical. I think at least we can say is that some of Keir Starmer's missions are ambitious. The mission to halve violence against women and girls, that is ambitious. The mission to achieve the highest economic growth in the G7 on a per capita basis and have it in every single region of the UK, I think is ambitious. So we can look at how they're going to achieve that, and we can question whether they have the means to achieve those goals. But the goals themselves are quite ambitious.
I'm also not entirely... I mean, the listener sees it as lying, possibly. I think it's fair for politicians to come into office, look at the situation, look at what actually is going on in the finances and in the departments, and to make decisions based on them. I mean, the governments always have an advantage going into an election because they have the entire civil service apparatus, which, okay, the civil service isn't helping them in a political way, but they have the information at their disposal in a way that opposition parties don't. I also think that there are things that Keir Starmer is planning, or that are Labour's policy, that are radical. The New Deal for workers, the way that Angela Rayner wants to really sort of fundamentally change and improve workers' rights, that's pretty radical. I think the reason you're not hearing more about it is because if Labour talks lots about it, the Conservatives will trash it. So I think there's probably a sort of reverse messaging thing going on where Labour does have some radical policies. They do have a plan. As Freddie says, you can read the plan. They're just not talking about the plan very much because they don't want the plan to be torn apart by the Conservatives for the next 8-9 months while we wait for an election.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.